Well, good morning and welcome to a very special edition of The Edge. I'm your host, Trevor Lewington. Thank you if you joined us last night. We've got an extra special guest here this morning as we talk to, as we do on this program, people that are making a difference in Southern Alberta, shaking things up. We've got someone today that's shaking things up in the provincial politics scene, so I'm excited to have our guest here. Honourable Kathleen Ganley is a former Minister of Justice, currently the MLA for Calgary Mountain View, and perhaps more importantly today, the very first candidate to jump into the NDP leadership race. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a great time. Hopefully you've had a chance to sort of, relax a little bit in between all this zooming around the province. I would imagine it's been a bit of a whirlwind.
It has indeed, but I have to say it's one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had. The people sort of coming forward to support are just
Nice.
really it energizes.
Nice. Now, I think a lot of people know you from when you were in cabinet during the NDP government, but I'm not sure people know about your background. My understanding is you worked some retail jobs. You were, you've done some things. You went to law school a little bit later. Perhaps you could talk sort of about your pathway and how you came to be in law school and then sort of in employment practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first degree was actually in psychology,
Okay.
and I was one of those people who, my parents' generation, it's like you go to university, you get a degree, you get a good job, right?
This is how things work. This is the path.
Yes, and I think a lot of us came out with our social science degrees and were surprised to discover our good jobs weren't just there waiting for us. And so I worked at a bank, I worked at a restaurant, I even taught preschool for a little while. So
You are a very brave woman. Okay.
I did a lot of things, and ultimately I went back, I studied philosophy, and then I went into law school. And in law school, partly through that experience, I sort of developed a certain passion for, the rights of employees and of workers, and I wound up at a union-side labor and employment firm.
Nice. And so, you're in private practice, you've gotten out of law school, you're establishing yourself as a lawyer. 2015 election is on the horizon. How does one decide that I'm going to stick my hand up and go through that gauntlet?
So I was approached by a couple of folks, and ultimately what I decided, so where I ran in Calgary, Buffalo, historically, the take for the NDP was between 4 and 6%.
Okay.
So our aim was to get that up to 10% when I ran, and my hope was to go around and talk to people about economics, to talk to them about how giving more to those at the top doesn't turn the economy, and that instead, when we support those at the bottom and in the middle, that actually is what improves the economy, and to talk as well about sort of what I would call upstream intervention, but essentially the fact that a dollar that you invest in education today will save you 6 in the long run.
In social costs and other challenges down the road.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And as Justice Minister, you see that sort of thing very, very clearly.
So you graduated from the University of Calgary in 2012?
2011 with a law degree.
Okay, and then really a few short years later, you're being sworn in as Minister of Justice.
That's right.
Talk about that ride. That must have been a bit of a surreal experience.
Yeah, it was. It was definitely a surreal experience, and it was. Most justice ministers don't. They don't come at it with 2.5 years. Usually, they're people who've had a lot of years to practice.
Right.
The nice thing about lawyers, in my experience, is that they are convinced by the evidence in most cases. So I just figured I would, read everything and talk and listen and do my best job to make sure that I was doing a good job, and that was actually persuasive to folks. So I think I actually have stood the longest as a justice minister of anyone in the last decade. So.
Okay, that's a compliment. It's not an easy job, right? You're responsible for representing the province on legal matters, but you're also responsible for reforming the system and managing all of its constituent parts. Very complex.
Yeah, so it was amazing. I think we got a lot of chances to make really progressive change. We also had, you always get some things that come at you that are a bit surprising. The drop in the price of oil was definitely a challenge that we faced. We also had the federal government decided to legalize pot then, so I was responsible for that file as well. And I actually think we wound up doing the best of any province in the country, so I'm pretty proud of that.
So is there one, obviously some enormous projects and some enormous complexity you dealt with as minister. Is there anything you look back on and go, this one thing is sort of the crown jewel in my time?
Oh gosh. I don't know that I would say there's one thing, but there's
Okay.
a few things that I'm pretty proud of. So one of the things we did was we changed the law so that when I used to work at Student Legal Assistance, we'd see people come in who had been ticketed for loitering. Usually the address was the drop-in center in Calgary, which is like essentially they hadn't gotten into the shelter for the evening. And then those tickets would go to warrant, and those people would be sent to jail for a couple of nights for not paying. So we got rid of that so that they don't go to warrant anymore.
Okay.
So if you're unable to pay, we don't jail you for that. And that, those people maybe don't make a better choice, but maybe they do, right? There's about 2,000 people a year who don't wind up incarcerated. There's a lot of evidence that putting people in jail, they don't usually come out better. That gives them the opportunity to make a different choice and maybe do something different.
Wow. Was there anything, again, in the job that surprised you? I mean, I think being a lawyer, you have some preconceived notions of what the top role in the judicial system could look like, but was there anything you were, I just didn't expect that, or I didn't know that was going to be a thing? Is there anything that stands out?
A couple of things. I think probably one of the things that surprised me the most was politics itself, right? So in a court of law, facts and argument and evidence are very important. In the court of public opinion, it turns out not so much. So the way politics operates and the way, a good story sometimes is more important than the facts. That was a bit of a surprise to me.
Yeah, and I would imagine courtroom procedures fairly standardized, fairly prescriptive. Politics can be a dynamic monster that shifts a lot, I would imagine.
It does indeed. It does indeed. So,
Okay.
and sometimes it's not about the best argument, it's about the shortest argument. It needs to be succinct, right? Because the judge is sitting there being paid to pay attention to what argument I make, whereas the public is not. So, got to be a little faster, a little more edgy.
Yeah, well, and especially in a social media world, right? It's all about that instant grab, and you've got my attention for 3 seconds or thereabouts. Yeah.
So you have to do the really hard reflecting on what it is you want to do, and then you have to figure out how to say it in sort of a more interesting way.
Right. Now, you also took on the role of Indigenous Relations within Cabinet, and there was obviously some significant moves in our journey on reconciliation. Can you speak about some of that and maybe what you're most proud of in terms of how you were able to influence that process?
Yeah, so I was in that file for about 8 months.
Okay.
We definitely did start rebuilding a relationship there. So I went all over the province. It was actually pretty cool. I got to be in a very little plane, a float plane at one point, but they actually let me hold the hold the controls for a minute. So
Nice.
That was pretty exciting.
Nice.
But we had a lot of conversations. I had a lot of opportunity to speak to people, and what really shocked me was you hear about stuff, right? You do. You hear that there's not clean water or what the living conditions are like, but having the chance to go out there and see that in a first world country, in a province with this much money,
Enormous wealth.
that there are people living in poverty is incredibly heartbreaking. I really feel that we did start taking some steps towards reconciling some of that. So we signed the agreement with the Lubicon during our time, and
Okay.
that was because they hadn't had an agreement previously with the government. That was a nation on which the housing stock was very, very poor. There were a lot of people living in poverty. It was really a situation that needed addressed. That was done, actually, Richard Fian was minister by that time,
Okay.
but that was something we started. We also started consultation with Métis on a harvesting policy, and that was something, that hadn't occurred before, and so that was a really good piece of progress. But I think, there's so much more that still needs to be done.
No, thank you for that. Now, obviously, you've been sort of now in opposition since the change in government and a few elections along the path, but I don't think people appreciate just how much time a member of the Legislative Assembly commits, no matter what side of the House they're on. Your daughter's 6, if I recall, and so
That's right.
how does this public service and the burden of public office, how does that work with your family, and how have you navigated that?
Yeah, so I think that it's incredibly important to allow women of childbearing age, whether they've had children or not, to participate in politics. I think it is a barrier to women. I have definitely talked to people in recruiting that have said, well,
I just can't.
I have small children, or I'm planning to have children. I think we just need to find a way to support people, and I have been incredibly lucky with my colleagues that they have been very supportive. A colleague of mine took over my file for 2 months as the pot bill went through the House while I left and gave birth. That was Marlon Schmidt actually who did that. My colleagues have been very supportive about sort of allowing me to balance those two things and making sure that I'm able to get home and be with my daughter when I need to be.
Yeah, my part-time job is mayor of Stirling, where I live, and so we have historically not had great female representation, even at the municipal level, and so we're actively looking for ways we can be more supportive and remove some of those barriers. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I know, in Calgary, we have a city councillor who's had a baby, and of course, remote work is very important in that journey for her, and we have another councillor who decided not to show up for work because he wanted to go for his golf game. So, I guess part of it is we need to stay focused on progress, and we need people not to wreck it for everybody else.
Yeah, the right tools for the right reasons, and fair enough. So now, of course, with this background, and you've decided to put your hand up, and we're first to jump into the race to replace Rachel Notley. Talk to me a little bit about the motivation there.
Yeah, so it's actually not dissimilar to what motivated me to run for politics originally. Okay. So I would like us to talk more about the economy. I think, in the last election, we made a huge amount of gains, and no one can suggest otherwise. I think we need to, going forward, talk to people a little more where they live. So I think one of the things we need to talk about is why our economic policies are better, why they do more to grow the economy, why having people with less have a little bit more in their pocket is actually better, and why, blanket sort of continual cuts on the wealthy, tax cuts for the wealthy isn't the best policy, right? So we actually did have what I thought was a very good suite of policies going into the last election. So we talked about PDP and the inclusion of recycled plastics as a feedstock. We had a boutique set of tax grants, some of which, like the digital media one, had been sort of growing the tech sector already.
Right.
And you saw that growth in 19, and then because it was cut off, it sort of went back down again. But we had some proven things. I think the difficulty was that it didn't really get out into the public, and so people, while they trust us on things like healthcare and education, I think they were a little nervous about the economy, and part of that just stems from the fact that the international price of oil collapsed the last time we were.
Yeah, the timing was not great.
The timing was not great, but part of it too stems from the fact that we aren't willing to walk into those conversations and take up space, and I think that we are right, and we can do that. Another thing that really motivated me is the team that I'm building around me. So Shannon Phillips is one of my campaign co-chairs, so is Irfan Sabir in Calgary. I have a bunch of support from my colleagues, and I think that team model, that putting forward, because I think the challenge we face right now as a province, and I know there are a lot of things that could be said about the UCP, but my issue with them, my biggest issue, is what I would call a lack of confidence. So, we have a healthcare system that is floundering. We have 60% of family doctors looking at leaving the province when we're already in crisis. We have cities in this province where people have to drive 200 kilometers to give birth. That is a real problem. It needs to be addressed. It can be addressed with policy solutions. And what I really think we see is just a lack of a government willing to come forward with the solutions and do the hard work to fix it. And that's what I think my team offers. I think we offer the experience and the competence to run the system.
Yeah, you've said publicly a few times that you feel like the UCP have completely the wrong priorities. So what is it you would do as leader? Like, what are your top priorities? What would you drive home that's different, I guess?
Yeah, so I think the priority should be on people. So right now, the biggest concern I hear from people is an inability to pay their mortgage, to pay their rent, to pay their electricity bill, to buy groceries. That's the biggest concern that people have.
Right.
And so the policies that I've brought forward, our first policy was around taxes.
Right.
And that's aimed specifically to address that. There will be more that we roll out to address that, but I think, that is for me a big piece of it is, talking to people where they're at. I also think that we really do need to keep an eye on government priorities like the healthcare system and like the education system. There are a lot of things, the pot legalization that we did when we were in government was one of them, that aren't very sexy, right? They don't get you a lot of media stories or a lot of political points, but they are what a government does. A government governs.
A lot of it's supposed to be boring.
Yeah,
right.
A lot of it is supposed to be boring. There's a huge amount of what the government does that's supposed to be boring. And I think maybe we could stand to bring a little bit of boring back, right? So the Sovereignty Act, no legal effect, lots of flash, right? This latest thing that Smith is on about with, trying to interfere with the relationship between a parent, child, and a doctor, lots of flash, lots of political points, not really good governance. I mean, half of what she said is literally in law already. Like, if your child is going to receive sexual health education, that's already, the parent is already notified, right? So a lot of it seems to be about flash and politics, and I think a lot more of it should be about just the basic governance of, how do we get a deal that attracts family docs to this province instead of sending them to BC?
Now, I mean, certainly I think that makes a lot of sense, but especially in the last two elections, that messages seem to fall flat with, in particular, rural voters. So is there an NDP brand issue, or is it just that those issues are not sort of resonating with the general public? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think those issues do resonate. I think that rural Albertans do care about healthcare and education. I think they care about their kids having access to the best. I think they care about their loved ones having a doctor when they need one.
Right.
I just think they also care about the economy and about being able to pay their bills. And I think through, just the course of history, because when we governed, it happened to be the case that the international price of oil dropped. We have a little bit of ground to make up there with people, and so I think we have to talk about it a lot more.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. As we swing to sort of this idea around oil in particular, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between sort of the federal NDP and the Alberta NDP in particular. I've heard some of the candidates talk about potentially not severing that relationship, but clearly making it distinct and different. And so what are your thoughts on that sort of, I guess, brand or perception around provincial Alberta NDP being just another part of the federal NDP?
Yeah, so I have heard a lot from members, particularly members in the south part of Calgary or in rural areas in smaller cities like Lethbridge, that they feel that the federal party doesn't reflect their values, that it is a drag on their brand, and that we should do something about that.
Okay.
I am open to having that conversation with members. I think that members are the party, and if what they want to move forward with is how to develop an Alberta NDP that is separate and distinct, then that is their right, and I'm happy to have those conversations.
Okay, well, thanks. I mean, obviously you've got a strong perception of Lethbridge, not only from your visits here, but your campaign co-chair is our esteemed representative for Lethbridge West. So I'm wondering what you think are the key issues in Lethbridge and our community, and how does that fit into your sort of priorities and platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in a lot of cases, the same priorities that we're talking about. So access to healthcare, access to family doctors, access to give birth here in Lethbridge. I think that's an important thing. Without the drive, yeah. I didn't really enjoy my experience of being in labor. I can't imagine having done it on the highway. So I think that that's something we owe to people. I think education is a big one too, but I also think, economics, the economic pieces, the ability to afford housing, the ability to afford one's electricity bill are big priorities. Those are things we're going to talk about a lot.
Okay.
I also think public safety is probably an issue, right? And how do we address that? So what I will tell you from my time as Justice Minister is that most of the police chiefs agreed that affordable housing is the single best investment that you can make in public safety. So that's a long-term priority, but in the short term, we need to come up with real solutions to address those issues.
Kind of getting into the wraparound services and treating the person as opposed to the behavior, those kinds of issues, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, I mean, you brought up economics a few times. That's obviously near and dear to my heart as an economic developer. So, full disclosure there. Is there anything that you see needing to change? You've talked about the tax changes, but is something like a digital media tax credit something you would consider? Is it those targeted initiatives, or sort of the current government's approach to lowest tax jurisdiction in most of North America? What's your thoughts on how that difference
So
there?
I think the targeted tax programs are better. I think they're better because they have a proven track record at growing specifically in the areas that we want to see growth. I also think that what we measure tends to really drive, what policy we put forward. So I think, when we talk about, say something like we have 4.4% economic growth, right? That's vesting to say 5% of the population.
Right.
Is that better than 4.3% economic growth that vests to 80% of the population?
I gotcha.
I'm not 100% sure that's the case. I do still think we can keep up that strong economic growth with those sort of suite of tax credits. I do think that we need to be concerned about where the tax burden is falling. That's why the program I've put forward would basically exempt anyone making less than $26,000 a year from provincial taxes. I think that will put more money in their pocket. I think that $400 a year will go into driving economic activity. I think, when you invest in those sort of boutique tax credits, yes, it requires a lot more work, it requires a lot more thought, it requires a lot more planning, but it does grow new areas of the industry, and it grows sort of smaller and mid-sized businesses as they're scaling
Right.
up. And those often, because they're close to home, they often employ people at better wages and in jobs that are sort of sustainable to the long term, and I think that that's what people want at the end of the day.
Kind of that more targeted surgical approach in supporting specific pieces of the economy.
Yeah.
Okay. And you spoke a little bit about this, the Sovereignty Act. And so, your perspective on Alberta's relationship with our current federal government and sort of that relationship in Canada, what would you do different as leader of the NDP or, perhaps as premier than, say, our current administration?
Yeah, so I think we need to be working with the federal government, even in instances where we don't agree, and there have been some instances, the Clean Electricity Regulation, for instance, where we've had some differences from the federal government, and I think those are things that need to be talked about. But, the result of all this fighting between the federal and provincial government is that the sort of the tax credits, like how much you're going to get on carbon capture and storage, took 3 years to roll out.
Okay.
And those are investments, like if we want to decarbonize, those are investments we need to see now. Like the sooner the better. We've been talking about this thing for a very long time, but because of all the fighting, we didn't get it for 3 years, right? Well, there's ongoing right now, carbon contracts for differences, that's an active conversation. Rather than making a public offering, so saying like this is what's available, they're going by way of one-off negotiation. Maybe the provincial government couldn't have done something about that, but maybe they could have, right? So this process will take a lot longer than it needs to. It will delay projects that could be going in the ground now, that could be creating jobs right now, that could be creating economic activity right now, and they could be addressing climate change right now. So I think the sort of failure to be willing, yes, we do have to take a hardline position in certain instances, but often working together is better. Our government, when we were in government, what we did was we did targeted polling and then advertising into other jurisdictions in the country. We took support for pipelines from 40% in other provinces to 70%. And that's how we were able to convince the federal government that they should buy us a pipeline. Now, there have definitely been some issues in the construction.
It was not a flawless project, but
It was not a flawless project, but we still need, even to this day, that capacity.
Right.
So that is a really important thing, and I think, we got that done. I'm not sure that the current provincial government would have gotten it done.
okay. Now, I'll shift gears a little bit here as we wrap up. We're almost out of time, and I want to be respectful that you've got an absolutely packed day here in Lethbridge today.
But it's very exciting.
But we're glad you're here. As you look back on your own personal journey, be it education, as a mom, your various jobs, is there anything that prepared you for this current journey? Is there anything you look back on and go, that was a key part of who I am today, and I'm taking that with me as I go forward into whatever this next adventure is?
Oh my gosh, there are so many things. I actually think so. One might say taking degrees in psychology and philosophy didn't sort of lead to where I am the way law did. I actually think the ability to sort of analyze arguments and understand where people are coming from and what it is
powerful,
they're
right?
actually saying. I actually think that turns out to be a really, really good skill set, and that is what I hope to take forward, is the ability to listen to people and understand what they're really saying and what they're really talking about, because I think, as we move forward, talking to people about, meeting them where they are and talking to them about the real issues to them, people aren't going to be thinking about sort of big picture stuff if all of their energy is focused on how do I pay my rent, how do I feed my kids, right? That's very much what we're hearing from people right now. So that's what
They're in survival
we're
mode,
addressing.
essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to think big picture when you're in survival mode, and that's not anything that's wrong with people. That's just human nature, right? You're going to make sure that you're sheltered and your kids are fed first.
Absolutely. Oh, okay. And just to expand on that a little bit, I think about your, vying for the top job in the provincial government. This show, we typically talk about, we get local entrepreneurs, local community leaders to talk about the key life lessons they've learned that's helped them. What advice would you give to aspiring entrepreneurs, or in this context, aspiring politicians? What advice would you give them on how to get engaged, get involved, and perhaps follow in your footsteps?
What I would say is approach it with thoughtfulness and humility. Going into politics, I think, a lot of people get into politics because they think they have the answers. My experience has very much been that, yes, you need a set of values. You should absolutely stand for something. But I think you need to be willing to listen to those around you, because everyone's going to have a different perspective. And so coming at it from the I have the answers perspective is not really good for anyone.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us here on The Edge. Appreciate your answers and being here with me today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.
That concludes our special edition today with the Honourable Kathleen Ganley. We wish her luck in the NDP leadership race, and we'll see you here on March the 21st at 6 p.m. when Dr. Pardeep Athwal will be here to talk about her journey as the owner and entrepreneur behind Back in Balance Wellness Centre. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Thank you.